Hey, this is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page. Hope you're doing well today. Coming back again live on our study through Luke's account of the life of Christ. We are in Luke chapter 6 this morning, and it's been a rainy day so far. It's Wednesday, May 27th, and it's been thundering and lightning, a lot of rain. So if you hear that in the background, hear some weird noise in the background, you'll know what's going on. Good morning, Connie. Good to see you today. All right, so like I said, we're in Luke chapter 6. Hey, good morning, Miss Marissa. I hope you're doing well. Good to see you on here. Luke chapter 5 we covered yesterday. We went through 39 verses yesterday. Luke chapter 6 is a bit longer than that, but there's so much in Luke chapter 6 that my plan is to only look at the first 19 verses today. So we'll cut it in two. So we looked at Luke chapter 5 yesterday, Jesus calling his first four disciples, a couple of different miracles, his call of Matthew or Levi, and then the comparison of his way with the old way. So we get to Luke chapter 6. Good morning, Lyle. Good to see you on here today. We get to Luke chapter 6, and we have more miracles. We have some run-ins with the Pharisees, and the reason my plan is to only cover half of Luke chapter 6 today is because of his teaching that begins in verse 20. There is so much good stuff from verse 20 through the end of the chapter. Well, what's the last verse in Luke chapter 6? Verse 49. So we'll plan on doing that tomorrow. That's my plan anyway. Good morning, Mr. Danny. Good morning, Asleys. Glad to see all of you on here today. All right, so let's get into it. Luke chapter 6. So what we have here in the first 11 verses is what I call Sabbath issues. Sabbath issues. This is something that we see come up quite often in the gospel accounts, where Jesus does something, and most of the time when we see it, he's performing a miracle on the Sabbath day, and he's condemned for doing that. So I want to discuss that a little bit at length today to talk about the Sabbath, because I do think there are some misunderstandings about it. A book that I got recently, in fact, it's right back here behind me. I've been reading it a little bit at a time because it's kind of heavy reading, and it's a very long book. But it's the Mishnah, which is basically a collection of documents from the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century AD. Basically, the best way I know to put it is it's a Jewish commentary on the old law. I would compare it to basically like a bunch of rabbis sitting around just giving their thoughts, giving their comments on the law. So there's one section, or actually two chapters in that book, on Sabbath regulations that were created not by the Word of God, but by Jewish tradition. So when we run into Jesus and these, what I call Sabbath issues, what's happening in these passages is Jesus is not breaking the law, and we'll talk about that too. He's not violating God's revelation of the Sabbath. He is violating a man-made tradition. He's violating oral laws that had been passed down by various rabbis throughout the centuries. And so when their principles are violated, they become offended and they think Jesus is sinning. So the first first 5 verses here, we have this incident. So we start reading in Luke chapter 6 and verse 1. Now it happened on the second Sabbath after the first that he went through the grain fields, and his disciples plucked the heads of grain and ate them, rubbing them in their hands. And some of the Pharisees said to them, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" So again, there are several passages in your Old Testament that address the restrictions that were laid out specifically by God in direct connection with resting on the Sabbath day. So I'm going to turn back real quick. I'm going to mark my Bible here in Luke chapter 6. I'm going to go back to Deuteronomy chapter 23. And I want to look at mention something here real quick about the Sabbath. You have to eat, okay? Now, there were obviously certain restrictions. No baking, no boiling, no gathering. That's found in Exodus chapter 16. I think it's verses 22 through 26. There were some very specific things that were restricted on the Sabbath day. However, the Pharisees, the oral traditions that had been handed down over the centuries went a lot further than God's revealed restrictions. So Deuteronomy 23, verses 24 and 25. When you come into your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat your fill of grapes at your pleasure, but you shall not put any in your container. When you come into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the heads with your hand, but you shall not use a sickle on your neighbor's standing grain. So we find here in Luke 6, Jesus and his disciples doing just that. They're following the law. They're hungry. It's the Sabbath day. They're hungry. The law permitted people to eat on the Sabbath day. They weren't harvesting, as Deuteronomy 23 there specified. They weren't running a combine through the field the way we'd say it today. They picked what was necessary to eat. The Pharisees, these Jewish rabbis over the years, had made it, again, a violation of the law, which God did not do. They made it a violation of the law to, the way I see it here in Luke 6, to even eat. Hey, Miss Jean, good to see you. Good to see you, Mark. Hope you all are doing well today. They're not violating the law here in Luke chapter 6. So Jesus challenges their challenge. He turns it on them. So let's notice what he says. Luke 6 and verse 3. Have you not ever read this, what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him. Now, if you wanted to read that, you would go to 1 Samuel chapter 21 and read about when David was running for his life and some people provided for him. He went into the house of God, took and ate of the showbread, and also gave some to those with him, which is, now notice what Jesus says here, which is not lawful for any to eat, but the priests. Leviticus 24, the old law spelled out very specifically these laws. David violated that law. So what's Jesus' point? The Pharisees, the Jewish people in general, would never have condemned David. David is the king. David is kind of held up as the standard of goodness in the Jewish mind. They wouldn't condemn him for specifically for violating a specific law of Moses, but they would condemn Jesus for violating one of their man-made traditions. So his response to them is this: the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus kept the Sabbath because he was a faithful Jew. He kept the whole law because he was a faithful Jew. And he didn't sin. We know that. Sin is a violation of law. He didn't sin. Therefore, he did not violate the law. What he violated was their oral, their handed down traditions over the centuries. But I want to show you something here. Let's see. Here's how I want to say it. When he made that statement in Luke 6 and verse 5, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. Well, hey, Mike, I'm glad you're finally back. Good to see you today. What Jesus said here in Luke 6 and verse 5, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. So I was in a discussion the other day with a man about the law of Moses and Jesus, what Jesus said here. And he said, since Jesus is the author of the law, he can violate it. He's not, in fact, the man said he is not subject to the law of Moses. That's not what Jesus is saying. He's not saying here that, well, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, therefore I can break the Sabbath. What he's saying is that he's the author of that law. He is, again, and we talked about this yesterday from Luke chapter 5, he is God in the flesh. That's how he could forgive sins. That's how he could heal a paralyzed man. That's how he could heal leprosy. He is Emmanuel. So he's not saying, hey, I have permission to break the law because I am Jesus. He didn't reserve the right to violate it. He knows that he didn't violate it. That's his point. So sometimes what he says here in Luke 6 and verse 5 is misunderstood. He didn't have the right to break the law. He was as subject to the law as the next Jewish man was. He's just saying, I know, I wrote it. We need to understand that, understand his authority. So now you have another Sabbath event in verses 6 through 11. And when you read the words, the way this text is worded, you see that these people are not in a search for truth. They don't care about what's right. He goes into a synagogue. There was a man there whose right hand was withered, and the scribes and Pharisees, again, the same group of people, the text then says, watched him closely. They're staring at him. They're waiting for him. The idea is they're anticipating him to do something. What is it? Whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. So, again, this shows their motive, their motivation for what they do and what they say. But notice again, Jesus' divine nature pointed out here in verse 8. But he knew their thoughts. That all the text tells us is they're watching him and they're waiting. They're anticipating, and he knows what's going through their mind. Again, that is evidence of his deity, that Jesus is the Christ, that he is the Son of God. So he knows what they're thinking. He tells the man with the withered hand, all right, I want you to stand up, stand here in front of me. I will ask you one thing. He's talking to those people who were watching him. I'll ask you one question. Is it lawful on the Sabbath day to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy? Now, these are the same people that in other passages. So, just for instance, I'm going to turn over here real quick to Luke chapter 13 and verse 15. Luke 13:15. The Lord then answered him and said, Hypocrite, does not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or donkey from the stall and lead him away to water it? And then you go to Luke chapter 14, verse 5. He answered them, saying, Which of you, having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into a pit, will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they couldn't answer him a word. So when he poses this question here in Luke chapter 6 and verse 9, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or evil, to save life or destroy it? They know the answer. They don't care. That's the thing. They're not interested in truth. He has not violated the law. Again, going back to Luke chapter 6 and verse 5, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. I know the law. I've not violated. Now, David violated it. Anyway, when he had looked around at them all, Luke 6:10 says. Now, Mark adds another bit of information. I've got it written here. Mark chapter 3 and verse 5. He looked round about on them with anger because of the hardness of their hearts. He knows their motives. He knows their thoughts. He knows they don't care about the truth, that they just want to accuse him so they can have something to discredit him, to arrest him, whatever. Shows their motivation. Stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. But now notice, so he does this good thing. He's condemned them publicly by saying, hey, you know what, is it okay to do good or evil? And he points out throughout his teaching, you would do the same thing on the Sabbath day, but you'll condemn me. Their response is this, verse 11. But they were filled with rage. I like that word in the Greek language. It's annoios. Sounds familiar? Annoios. They're annoyed. And it's the sense not just that they're annoyed like we think of the term, hey, this is getting on my nerves. They are out of their minds. That's what this Greek word means. He is driving them crazy, not because he's doing anything wrong, but because he's pointing out their hypocrisy. And again, like Mark 3:5 says, the hardness of their hearts. They didn't care about this guy with the withered hand, and they didn't care about Jesus other than, hey, can we get him in trouble? That's their motivation. They're filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. So there's your Sabbath issues. He didn't violate the law. And him saying, hey, I'm Lord of the Sabbath, doesn't mean he reserved the right to violate the law, as some people will try to teach. He's saying, I know the law, and I've not violated it. People were allowed to eat on the Sabbath day. People were allowed to do good things on the Sabbath day. They were forbidden from unnecessary labor. These things are not unnecessary labor. So, all right, let's move on here. Luke chapter 6, verses 12 to 16. We have the record of Jesus calling the 12. It came to pass in those days that he went out in the mountain to pray and continued all night in prayer to God. Now, I think that phrase there at the end of verse 12 is extremely important. He's getting ready to choose certain individuals who are responsible as Ephesians chapter 2 tells us, for laying the foundation of the church. It's established upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. The work that these men, that they're commissioned with, if you want to use that term, is to establish the kingdom of God on earth. He spends all night in prayer. Again, now, and I mentioned this yesterday, talking about his praying and things of this nature. He is the Son of God. And if he found it important to pray to God, not only regularly, but on an occasion like this, all night, how much more important to us should prayer be as Christians today? So, when it was day, he called his disciples among himself, and notice this, from them. He's got a lot of disciples. He's going to have 12 apostles. And sometimes the Bible will call the apostles the disciples. All apostles are disciples, but not all disciples are apostles. So he calls all of his disciples together, and from them he chose 12. He chose 12. Nobody can make himself or claim for himself, hey, I'm an apostle. Jesus had to directly choose, commission, select you. That happens here with these 12. And then you turn over to Acts chapter 1. Judas has committed suicide, and so there are two men who meet the qualifications to fill his position, to fill his office. Well, in the 11's process of trying to decide who it should be, they cast lots and they pray. And so I'm looking here. Let me find the verse. Acts chapter 1 and verse 23. They proposed two, Joseph and Matthias. They prayed, and they cast lots, and the lots fell on Matthias. They understood that the choosing of apostles was strictly with the Lord. Of course, Paul was chosen later, and again chosen directly by Jesus. There are no apostles alive on earth today. So he chooses these 12, going back to Luke chapter 6, and it's interesting when you notice every time the 12 are listed together in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Peter is always first, and Judas is always last. And I think this is not, I don't think this is insignificant. When it always mentions Judas, it says, who also became a traitor, or who also would betray him. We've got to remember when Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are writing, they're looking back into history. They're writing by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, but they are looking back to things that they have been through or things that had already happened. And so that it's just interesting to note the uniformity of these accounts when all 12 apostles are listed together. So he chooses these 12 from among his disciples. And there's some implications there about Judas. A lot of people believe that Judas was always, that he was predestined to fall. Well, that's not true. It is true that Jesus knew who would betray him. The Bible tells us that plainly. But Judas absolutely had a choice in the matter. I think it's important to read the first several verses of John chapter 12, and we learn about Judas's personality, his habits. He was a thief. So when he was offered money, he took it. He became a traitor. Anyway, it's another discussion for another time. So let's look at verses, next section here, Luke 6, verses 17 to 19. Jesus now heals a multitude. So he's chosen the 12. He comes down with them, stood on a level place, a crowd of disciples, and a great multitude. This is not just a few select people who get to see the miracles of Jesus, as it's arranged today with faith healers and so-called miracle workers today. This is everybody, including his own disciples, who are now known as apostles. You've got Judeans, you've got inhabitants of Jerusalem, but you've also got people from Tyre and Sidon, which is up on the north end, we might say, the far north of the Promised Land, right on the Mediterranean coast. They came to hear him and be healed of their diseases. And notice this, as well as those who were tormented with unclean spirits. And that, we looked at that yesterday, Jesus' ability to cast out demons and that miraculous ability. And they were healed. That's all the text says. They were healed. But then verse 19 says, and the whole multitude sought to touch him, for power went out from him and healed them all. And again, I think that's important. Healed them all. It wasn't just a few. It wasn't people who bought a front row ticket to his crusade who got healed. It was people with, a variety of diseases. Again, yesterday from Luke chapter 5, we talked about the man who was paralyzed. We've got demon possession. His power was unlimited. And you have multitudes of people witnessing these things. He healed them all. 3 words. And it's just one of those things, it's word association. Help you remember things about the miracles of not only Jesus, but also the apostles. IOU. Immediate, observable, undeniable. If you can remember those 3 points, it's a good reminder of authentic miracles. So we talked a little bit, just for instance, yesterday about demon possession. And, Roman Catholicism's teachings and practices on exorcism, sometimes it'll take weeks. You've got to go through certain steps to even get an exorcism, certain processes, permissions, and it may take a long time to be healed. Those are not miracles. Demon possession doesn't happen anymore. That ended sometime in the 1st century. I referenced you yesterday to Zechariah chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, that during the days of when the fountain would be opened for sin and for unrighteousness, it's a reference to Jesus and his blood, that during that period of history, the prophets would pass out of the land and the unclean spirits would pass out of the land. Miracles have ceased. The signs that men were able to perform in the 1st century no longer occur today. And the Bible's very clear on that. But Jesus had the power, again, all manner of diseases, demon possession, and those things were done immediately, observably, and they were undeniable. Just look at the account of, let me turn over there real quick. John chapter 11, when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. So these are the Pharisees discussing, all right, what do we do about this? John chapter 11, I'll start in verse 47. Then the chief priests and Pharisees gathered a council and said, "What shall we do? For this man works many signs." And again, that word sign in the Greek, semeion, it means a token or a mark, an indicator. His miracles indicated, they proved that he was the Son of God, and they knew it. He's working these signs. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him. Why would they believe in him? Because he's working these signs. Miracles were immediate, observable, undeniable. Doesn't happen today. We need to understand that. All right, so that's it. Like I said, the reason I'm only doing half of Luke chapter 6 today is because there's so much in the second half. And very practical teaching in the remainder of Luke chapter 6, verses 20 through again, verse 49. So that's it for today. I appreciate all of you being on here. If you have any questions or comments about anything I've said, please feel free to add it here in the comment section. Feel free to send me a private message through Facebook, to me personally, or to our page, Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring. If you know somebody that would like to go through these studies who doesn't do Facebook, send them to our YouTube channel, Mammoth Spring Church of Christ. When I finish doing the live stream here, I go right over to YouTube and upload it immediately. So anyway, I appreciate y'all being here today, and I will see you tomorrow at the same time for the rest of Luke chapter 6. Have a good day.